At 4:32 a.m., in the outer timber belt of Grays Harbor County, Washington, federal agents began what officials would later call the largest manhunt and rescue strike ever launched against a domestic abduction and trafficking network hidden inside the Pacific Northwest wilderness. By sunrise, 63 properties had been hit, 214 victims had been recovered or placed into emergency protection, 41 suspects were in custody, 118 firearms had been seized, and investigators had uncovered a hidden machine of violence stretching from remote logging roads to shell companies in Seattle, Tacoma, Spokane, and beyond. And the most chilling part was not the body count, not the money, not even the miles of forest used as a shield. It was the claim buried inside the first federal briefing. This was not just a trafficking ring. This was a predator's private kingdom, built in the dark, protected by fear, and designed to outlive every search party sent to destroy it. And if you think that sounds like the worst of it, stay with this story, because the next layer was even more disturbing. At 4:32 a.m., the roads were wet with cold mist and the pines stood like black pillars against a dead sky. The towns nearest the strike zones still looked asleep, neon motel signs humming over empty highways, diner lights burning for no one. The distant wail of a siren carried low through the fog. Then the silence cracked. FBI tactical teams rolled in from 3 directions. DIA agents locked down suspected narcotics sites connected to the trafficking routes. ICE special response units hit transport houses and forged document hubs. DAY's coordinators tracked movement on encrypted devices in real time. SWAT teams moved through the tree line in black armor, night vision glowing faintly under the rain. In less than 4 minutes, 7 locations were breached almost at once. A shuttered hunting lodge outside Aberdeen, a fenced machine shop near Shelton, 2 rural cabins hidden under dense fir cover, a converted horse barn in Lewis County, a roadside tavern serving as a recruitment front, and an underground bunker dug into a private timber tract that did not exist on county maps. The first doors came off under hydraulic rams. Flashbangs cracked through old wood and metal. Windows blew outward. Men ran through hallways carrying duffel bags packed with cash, burner phones, zip ties, forged IDs, and vacuum-sealed bundles of narcotics. One suspect tried to flee through a crawl space with a backpack containing methamphetamine, heroin, and fentanyl pills meant to keep captives sedated, compliant, or terrified. Another opened fire from the loft of the barn before agents pinned him against a support beam and dragged him down in cuffs. In the tavern basement, they found restraints bolted into the floor, ledgers written in coded initials, fake work rosters, and a wall map marked with routes through Forest Service roads that bypassed patrol patterns. In the machine shop, under tarps and engine blocks, they found a vehicle modification bay built for hidden compartments, cage partitions, and false flooring. In the lodge, behind a concealed pantry wall, agents recovered sealed evidence trunks containing personal items from missing women, juveniles, migrant laborers, and drifters whose names had been circulating through cold case systems for years without ever connecting to one another. And still, the operation was only getting darker. At 4:51 a.m., inside the bunker beneath the timber tract, the strike teams found something that changed the case from a brutal trafficking investigation into a national-level emergency. The bunker was not improvised. It was engineered. Reinforced concrete. Air filtration, battery backups, hard-lined communications, a hidden server room cooled by industrial fans, a steel vault behind a false weapons cabinet. Inside were encrypted hard drives, satellite maps, hand-drawn patrol avoidance diagrams, medical supply inventories, counterfeit identity kits, and 3 sealed lockboxes with coded tabs labeled Harvest, Black Trail, and Quiet Pines. One of those boxes contained payment records tied to transport schedules and cryptic initials, later matched to deputies, dispatchers, trucking brokers, and a juvenile court clerk. Another contained photographs from surveillance positions overlooking trailheads, shelters, recovery homes, and county roads. The last held a handwritten doctrine, page after page, outlining how fear, terrain, and bureaucracy could be used together to make people disappear without triggering a federal pattern. That was the moment agents understood they were not just dealing with scattered cartel members, traffickers, or freelance sadists. They were inside a system, a method, a hunting grid. By 6:13 a.m., the evidence was already on its way to a federal cyber forensics lab in Tacoma, where analysts in dim blue light began tearing into the encryption. Monitors filled with transaction chains, burner device pings, logistics codes, false nonprofit filings. Fuel purchases, generator contracts, land trusts, equipment rentals, and ghost companies registered under names that sounded harmless. Cedar Mercy Foundation, North Cascade Search and Relief, Evergreen Timber Renewal, Black Harbor Transit, Pine Shield Logistics. To the outside world, they looked like charities, eco-restoration groups, outdoor education outfits, trucking subcontractors, or survivalist supply retailers. But as the encryption broke, the network started to reveal its real shape. Vehicles bought under one shell company were moved through another. Land was purchased through third trusts and then transferred into obscure holding entities. Rural properties were paid for with disguised consulting invoices and maintenance grants. Donations to fake nonprofit foundations flowed in, then out, then back again through offshore accounts routed through Belize, Cyprus, and Panama before landing in domestic cash-heavy businesses. Restaurant chains laundered small amounts. Logistics firms washed larger transfers. Agricultural freight lanes were used to move people, restraints, forged papers, stimulant packs, cash, and surveillance hardware under the appearance of ordinary commerce. At 7:04 a.m., analysts assembled the first complete network board, and at the center of it was a code name, Operation Hollow Lantern. Not the Federal mission, the Predator's mission. The architecture of his world, every road, every handoff point, every safe shed, every compromised contact, every fallback camp in the forests of Washington and Oregon. All of it pulsing on a giant digital map like a nervous system. And linked to its core, again and again, was the same encrypted authorization key, the same routing discipline, the same purchasing logic, the same obsession with containment, silence, and terrain. The key belonged to a man the outside world barely knew existed. His legal name was Elias Vane. In local rumors, he was called the Woodsman, the Ghost Hunter, the man who could survive 3 winters off-grid without touching a town. On paper, he was a reclusive survival consultant and land use contractor. In reality, according to the files, he was the designer, enforcer, and supreme controller of the Northern Woods Syndicate, a domestic abduction and trafficking ring that blended cartel discipline with serial killer ritual. He did not just exploit the wilderness, he weaponized it. That is where the story turns from corruption into something colder. Elias Vane was not a careless monster moving victims through chaos. He was methodical. He treated forests like walls, weather like camouflage, bureaucracy like a weapon, and people like inventory. His encrypted directives were linked to transport corridors, holding sites, drug sedation schedules, convoy windows, hunting stand surveillance posts, and coded silence events believed to correspond to murders. In one recovered file, he described remote Washington not as a hiding place, but as a permanent fortress, not a temporary trafficking zone, a sovereign landscape of fear. This was not negligence. It was engineered predation. This was not a broken system he slipped through. It was a machine he built inside weak places until those places started working for him. And for the investigators staring at the screens that morning, one fact became impossible to ignore. If Hollow Lantern was real, then the nightmare had only just begun. At 5:40 a.m. The next day, before the Marine layer had burned off Puget Sound, a new command center came alive at Joint Base Lewis McChord. A digital map stretched wall to wall, lit with dozens of red markers pulsing across Aberdeen, Olympia, Tacoma, Yakima, Spokane, Bellingham, Walla Walla, the Olympic Peninsula, the Cascades, and the border corridors threading north and south through freight routes and forest access roads. Federal commanders stood under harsh white light and announced the second phase, total regional eradication. More than 1,100 federal personnel were assigned across the operation. 52 SWAT and tactical arrest teams, air surveillance platforms, Black Hawk helicopter support for remote insertions and medevac, U.S. Army aviation assets for overwatch in inaccessible terrain, days air coordination on border-adjacent routes, U.S. Navy maritime surveillance assistance along select inlets and port-linked movements, armored vehicles staged for fortified compounds, K-9 units, forensic recovery teams, mobile victim support teams, cyber response teams. It was the kind of deployment usually reserved for a hybrid threat, not a single domestic trafficking ring. But by then it was clear, the Northern Woods Syndicate had evolved into something far larger than a criminal crew. It was a distributed predator network, part cartel, part hunting cult, part transport empire. Then the hammer came down. In Yakima County, agents raided a produce distribution warehouse with concealed sleeping pens behind refrigeration units and seized 390 pounds of methamphetamine, 74 kilos of cocaine, 18 kilos of heroin, more than 640,000 fentanyl pills packaged in feed sacks, and shipping logs that linked narcotics loads to human cargo transfers. In the foothills east of Olympia, a drug fortress mansion disguised as a prepper compound went dark under rotor wash as FBI teams cut power, breached the outer gate, and recovered long guns, suppressors, thermal scopes, cash bricks, and a subterranean cell lined with soundproof insulation. Near the border, ICE and Deech units rolled up a migrant smuggling convoy using falsified farm labor manifests as cover. Inside the escort vehicles, they found forged permits, burner radios, sedation kits, and route cards timed to maintenance shutdowns at way stations. Outside Port Angeles, SWAT teams hit a marina storage yard tied to hidden boat transfers and found containers outfitted as temporary holding chambers. In the Cascades, on land accessible only by logging switchbacks, agents stormed a remote super camp where victims had been moved between tents, trailers, and buried storage containers hidden under netting and brush. In Spokane, cyber agents and tactical teams seized a covert communications hub operating out of an electronics recycling business, where routers, cloned phones, satellite uplinks, and surveillance archives connected local disappearances to broader interstate movement. Every hour produced another shock. More cash. More guns. More ledgers. More graves suspected, then confirmed. More suspects dragged out in shackles, some screaming, some silent, some stunned that the federal wave had reached them all at once. By noon, 89 additional arrests had been made. By early afternoon, more than 300 firearms had been seized across the region. Nearly $28 million in currency, crypto keys, bearer instruments, and laundered assets had been frozen or recovered. Victim advocates were moving nonstop. So were coroners. So were forensic anthropologists. Because what the teams found in those woods and compounds was not just trafficking infrastructure, it was a geography of human ruin. And when one exhausted official finally stepped before cameras that evening, the line that defined the day was as blunt as it was devastating. The underworld had taken more damage in 6 hours than in the last 6 years, but the worst betrayal was still waiting inside the records. Once the servers were cloned and the paper trail stabilized, investigators shifted to internal logs, patrol records, dispatch histories, warrant notifications, body camera gaps, county email archives, evidence room signouts, fuel card records, and courthouse access rosters. What they found made seasoned agents go quiet. This was not a case of 1 or 2 dirty officers. This was infiltration. 37 law enforcement and government-linked individuals were flagged in the first wave alone. Patrol deputies, a border liaison officer, 2 records clerks, a senior dispatcher, a juvenile services coordinator, 3 corrections staff members, a prosecutor's investigator, and a sitting county judge's aide. Their roles were not dramatic at first glance. That was exactly why they mattered. A patrol grid changed here. A road closure extended there. A report filed late. A camera malfunctioned. A welfare check redirected. A warrant service leaked. A transport van not inspected. A missing person classification downgraded. A trail search delayed until rain erased tracks. A raid schedule whispered just early enough for a camp to move. The payment methods varied, but the purpose did not. Some took cash. Some took land use favors, blackmail protection, narcotics, or offshore transfers routed through shell companies. Some were paid through phantom consulting contracts. Others were simply trapped by secrets and then used until they became useful criminals in uniform. Honest officers sat in interview rooms staring at names they knew. A veteran state trooper reportedly looked at one internal chart, saw 2 former academy classmates linked to convoy protection windows, and had to leave the room. One federal interviewer later described the atmosphere as spiritual damage, because once the pattern became visible, it was clear the Northern Woods Syndicate had not just bribed the system, it had grown a second enforcement system inside it. A parallel shield, a quiet police force answering not to law, not to the public, not even to survival, but to Elias Vane and the discipline of fear. Arrests followed fast. A deputy chief from a rural jurisdiction was taken from his driveway before dawn. A senior sergeant who had quietly manipulated patrol assignments was walked past his own stunned neighbors in handcuffs. A county emergency planner accused of rerouting search resources away from active trafficking zones was charged with conspiracy. Investigators alleged that dispatchers had timed radio traffic gaps to cover convoy movements, that certain supervisors falsified staffing shortages to thin rural patrols on selected nights, and that internal leak chains gave traffickers warning before multi-agency warrant service. One judge was not accused of direct participation, but aides around the office were investigated for manipulating docket timing in cases involving vulnerable juveniles and runaway classifications. The more agents pulled, the more the fabric came apart, and through it all, the same conclusion kept surfacing in briefings. The badge would have to be rebuilt from the ground up. Not polished, rebuilt. Then the map widened. When analysts finally stacked the transport data against freight records, port movement logs, trucking subcontractors, fuel purchases, and nonprofit grant trails, the Washington case stopped being only a Washington case. Hollow Lantern extended south into Oregon, east through Idaho and Montana corridors, and outward through commercial routes that touched California, Nevada, Arizona, and the upper Midwest. Agricultural shipments provided one layer of cover. Green energy equipment grants provided another. Search and rescue charity drives hid hardware buys. Outdoor youth programs masked recruitment and surveillance. Port-linked containers were altered with false manifests. Wait stations mysteriously went down for maintenance during select convoy windows. Rural road projects created detour lanes that just happened to open clean routes through lightly watched zones. On paper, everything looked fragmented. In reality, it was synchronized. The narcotics side of the network moved enough cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, and fentanyl each week to bankroll the rest without drawing one obvious signature. Human trafficking and migrant smuggling were folded in as noise, misdirection, labor exploitation, and portable revenue. Some victims were sold, some were used, some were silenced, some were never meant to leave the woods. And then investigators opened what they would later call the final catastrophic file. It was not a confession. It was a plan. Recovered from a dead drop archive inside Vane's server array, the file laid out a 10-year expansion doctrine. Acquire more land under conservation fronts. Deepen ties to freight contractors. Recruit ex-military survival instructors, compromised public servants, and violent offenders with wilderness skills. Expand sedation supply lines through fentanyl and meth channels. Use opioid casualties in urban areas to drown attention while rural disappearances remain statistically scattered. Build safe layers between abduction teams and command cells. Influence local elections through dark money spending. Place loyal intermediaries in emergency management, licensing offices, and land review boards. Create public-facing charities that generate goodwill while serving as data harvest and target selection platforms. Exploit the myth that forests are empty. Exploit the belief that victims on the margins are less likely to be searched for with urgency. Exploit silence. Exploit distance. Exploit shame. One line in that file chilled every room it entered. The future belongs to the one who controls the spaces the state cannot see. That was the realization no press conference could soften. The system had not merely been infiltrated. Parts of it had been redesigned for the predator's future. Hollow Lantern was not built to survive crackdowns for a month or a year. It was built to become permanent. So the final hunt focused on the man at the center. For 3 more days, federal teams swept ridgelines, cold camps, tunnel caches, hunting blinds, abandoned fire roads, and buried supply pits across remote Washington. Thermal drones scanned clear cuts. Helicopters worked the valleys. Trackers moved through brush so dense it swallowed sound. Rain came and went. Fog returned every night. More bodies were found. More victims were recovered alive. A network of handwritten fallback markers led agents toward the western slopes of the Cascades, where Elias Vane had prepared layered escape corridors through steep ravines and logging routes mapped years in advance. He knew dogs. He knew search patterns. He knew how weather erased evidence and how panic fractured coordination. That was why the last strike had to be surgical. At 3:17 a.m. On the 4th morning, federal trackers confirmed recent movement near a decommissioned fire lookout above a collapsed mining spur in remote Washington forest land. By 3:49 a.m., perimeter teams were in place. At 4:03 a.m., a Black Hawk dropped a containment element on the North Ridge while ground units climbed from the south through wet stone and fallen cedar. At 4:11 a.m., Thermal picked up one heat source inside the Lookout Annex and two more in a lower crawl shelter. At 4:14 a.m., the first suspect ran and disappeared into brush before hitting a pressure alarm rigged from tripwire and shotgun shells. Seconds later, the mountain exploded with noise. Agents pushed forward anyway. One team breached the shelter and found two armed loyalists, a radio table, maps, restraints, and plastic bins filled with IDs, jewelry, and missing person posters with handwritten notes on the back. The annex above was worse. Blood traces, surgical tools, sedatives, trophy boxes, journal fragments written in a precise hand describing selection criteria, weather windows, and purification through control. If there had ever been a doubt that Elias Vane was both trafficker and methodical serial killer, it ended there. He was taken at 4:26 a.m., 50 yards below the lookout, pinned between boulders and salal brush after trying to crawl into a narrow drainage chute. No cinematic last stand. No speech. No empire-saving escape. Just mud, rain, torn gloves, and federal agents dragging the architect of Hollow Lantern out of the forest he thought could protect him forever. And maybe that is the most important part of this story. You watching right now. Predators like this survive by building mythology. They want the world to believe they are too hidden, too prepared, too savage, too far ahead. But in the end, even the shadow leaves a trail. When the first full briefing came after the capture, the numbers were almost too heavy to process. More than 300 victims located, rescued, or placed under emergency federal protection across the broader operation. Over 140 defendants charged or detained pending prosecution. Hundreds of firearms. Massive narcotic seizures. Dozens of compromised officials under investigation or arrest. Vast tracts of land tied to criminal holding sites marked for seizure and forensic recovery. But the numbers, as always, were only the surface. The deeper cost lived in the stories underneath them. The child who had been listed as a runaway and never searched for like a kidnapped victim. The migrant laborer transported through fake work channels and vanished into a shack beyond a logging road. The woman chemically controlled with fentanyl and meth moved as cargo between counties while false paperwork kept her invisible. The honest deputy who realized his own chain of command had been protecting the people he thought he was hunting. That is why stories like this strike so hard. Because power does not always announce itself with a flag, a speech, or open violence. Sometimes it arrives in silence, in delayed reports, in sealed roads, in missing paperwork, in ambition with no conscience, in a society that looks away from the disappeared because they seem too poor, too transient, too addicted, too broken, too far out in the woods to matter. Organized predation grows best where fear is privatized, where institutions can be bought in pieces, and where ordinary people stop believing the darkness belongs to them too. And the cost of that darkness is written in neighborhoods hollowed out by fentanyl, in families shattered by heroin and methamphetamine, in communities poisoned by cocaine pipelines and trafficking violence, in forests turned into prisons, in roads turned into corridors of human cargo, in homes where missing faces still hang on walls long after the calls stop coming. That is how empires of cruelty endure, not only through brutality, but through exhaustion, through the hope that people will eventually stop asking questions. So if you are still here, still listening, then hold on to the point this story leaves behind. Demand more from power. Demand more from silence. Demand more from any system that asks the vulnerable to disappear quietly. If you want stories like this dragged into the light, tap like so more people see it, and comment expose if you believe corruption, trafficking, and the machinery behind them should never be allowed to hide behind distance, money, or a badge.